Is pathological demand avoidance the same thing as autism? Is it the same as severe ADHD? Is it auDHD, or is it just severe anxiety? So today I'm going to take off my researcher and social scientist cap, and I'm going to speak to you from the perspective of a mom who 6 years ago felt completely forsaken, completely confused, and did not understand what was going on with her son. My son, Cooper, who 5 years ago had been extremely outgoing, active, social, and he went into nervous system burnout where he largely stopped speaking, eating, and was like a feral animal. Okay, so I want to share a belief of mine as a parent because I think it's helpful for parents like us, even if this is perhaps a controversial statement. So I do not believe that PDA is the same thing as autism. Okay, I think these two often coexist. They do for my son. But I think it's important to distinguish because there's a unique logic. There's also a unique sense of belonging of our experience as parents and also what helps our children. So I want to start with a story that I haven't shared yet, actually, because it's not PC, but I hope that it's helpful to some of you. So when I first moved to Michigan after my son went into burnout, my main concern was the fact that my son wasn't eating. Okay, so he, at the time, was only eating 3 different processed foods: Pirate's Booty, potato chips, and popcorn. Needless to say, I was extraordinarily distressed, and so I was looking for resources and support in the new town that I had just moved to in Michigan. And I met a couple other parents whose children were also at risk of or had had a feeding tube and were needing to do feeding therapy. And so they invited me to go to a support group, and they all had autistic children. At this time, my son did not have an autism diagnosis or any diagnosis. We were thinking it was more sensory processing disorder. So I remember the day that my husband and I were like, okay, we're going to try and make it to this support group. At the time, we were like, how do we leave the house? How do both of us leave the house, right? Because my son was so burned out, but had escalated fight-flight behavior that was often targeting his younger brother, who was only 1 at the time. But we organized a babysitter and very nervously got in the car and drove to the nearby university town to go to this support group because we were seeking support. And we went there, and there were a bunch of other parents. There were probably, 8 other families. And all of these families had autistic children, and all of their children had come to the support group. So some of them were non-speaking, some of them had a little bit lower support needs than others, but they were all autistic and diagnosed with autism with feeding struggles, okay? So all of these children played in another room with their special interests. So for example, one child, he was non-speaking, he had a magazine of all these different cars that he was interested in. That was his special interest. So he would come back and forth, sort of communicating with his mom, showing her the magazine, but largely letting her speak to the rest of the parents, right? And he seemed quite regulated. And then there were some other children who were playing with trains, there were Legos, and everyone was talking about, feeding tubes and this behavioral program at the local university that they had done successfully to help their child expand their eating repertoire. And my husband and I spoke to people, and we tried to understand, the different opportunities and options in our town for supporting extreme feeding challenges, restricted feeding challenges. And I got in the car after that support group, and I started weeping because I did not feel at all like I belonged there. I was like, okay, on a certain level, yes, we all have neurodivergent kids, right? And all of us are moving through radical acceptance of a life we didn't expect. And we're all trying to understand how to help our kids eat. At the same time, I said to my husband, how on God's green earth do you think we could have gotten our son here to play in this other room when he's PDA? Like, we couldn't have gotten him in the car. If he had come, there would be absolutely no way we could have had any conversation with the other parents, because he would have been constantly interrupting me. He would have needed undivided attention. And if I hadn't given it to him at that point in burnout, he would have started to destroy the other children's things, or he would incessantly interrupt me or start to have a meltdown. Okay, so first of all, I said to my husband, Jake, I was like, okay, like, all of these autistic children, even if they are disabled by their higher social communication support needs, they're not as disabled as my child in terms of nervous system stress and perception of threat. They're able to be independently playing when engaging in their special interests. They're able to be somewhat regulated, even if they have less ability than my son to communicate with words. Additionally, all the parents were connecting around the same type of behavioral therapy, intensive behavioral therapy at the university that had helped their children. And I was saying to my husband at the time, how could they even get their children to this therapeutic place 2 hours a day, every day? How could they get their child to engage in that therapy without having complete panic attacks? And how did this approach work? Okay? So why am I sharing this story? It's not to put PDA below or above autism. But I think it's important to say that this was a totally unique and distinct experience that my husband and I were having, like many of the families that we work with, right? Where I did not feel like I belonged in that group. I did not feel that my son was really that similar to a lot of these children. And I did not feel like any of the things that had worked for these autistic children, thank God, getting rid of their feeding tubes, going to this therapy intensively and getting feeding tubes taken out and starting to eat more. I'm so happy that these behavioral strategies worked for these autistic kids. And these weren't even ABA, they were just more behavioral, but these would not have worked for my son. Okay? And so from that moment, I had an aha moment, which was, this is not the same. These are not the same experiences. We are not having the same experiences. We can connect on a human level on, like, parenting a neurodivergent child is fucking hard. Like, acceptance is a real hard journey. Like, oh my gosh, it's totally different than neurotypical children. However, I didn't feel a sense of belonging. I didn't feel a sense of clarity, and I didn't feel a step forward in my journey, except that I was more clear on what did and didn't work. Okay, so we didn't return to that feeding group therapy, but it left a seed in me. And that seed was what blossomed or sprouted, very small seed sprouted as a mom over 5 years ago, before I started the business of At Peace Parents, which was a small blog with another mom here locally called PDA Parents, and one season of a podcast that we put out, and we recorded in her garage during the pandemic. The two of us, we would sit in snow pants, socially distanced, in the garage in winter, and we would talk about our experiences as parents of PDA children. Okay, why did we do this? We did it to create the space that did not exist for us. Okay, the support group, the voice, the podcast, that wasn't there. It doesn't mean that it's not wonderful to learn from podcasts and from experts on ADHD, autism, anxiety, etc., or that your child doesn't also have those things. My son is ADHD, autistic, severe anxiety, and PDA. But what was important to me was that parents had a place to feel seen, that they could learn a unique logic of their brain, of their child's brain, and perhaps their own brain, and nervous system, so that from that logic, they could make unique decisions to find peace, but also to support their children, okay? So I never want to create unnecessary conflict, and I think a lot of people in the PDA and neurodiversity space would disagree with me here. And I might be wrong as a researcher, but as a mother, I truly believe that we need to see PDA as its own unique neurotype in order to help families, okay? So one of the things that's worrying me, okay, so there's good news and there's bad news. So since we started our project 5 years ago, the awareness of PDA has blossomed, right? It's like now you can go on social media and there's so much stuff about PDA. There's new organizations, there's new parent coaches, there's all this good stuff. And it's exciting. I'm so happy that PDA awareness is growing. But the unfortunate part of this sort of trendiness of PDA is that what I'm seeing is that it's sort of being thrown into the neurodivergent bucket as like another add-on of like, okay, you know, just use these ADHD strategies or use these strategies for autistic kids that are neurodiversity affirming, right? Like sensory-based strategies or, you know, regulation strategies, co-regulation strategies, which is important, but I'm seeing things that are actually continuing to make parents feel alone, like they're doing it wrong and confused, okay? So I have been seeing content and information and even conferences being thrown in the PDA space that if I had gone to them 5 years ago when I was in the space, when I went to feeding therapy, I would have been extraordinarily triggered, felt ashamed, felt confused, and not known if I was doing something wrong, which is why I'm speaking to it. Okay, so let me give you an example. A recent thing that I saw about like correcting behavior of PDA kids, like it's like ADHD, PDA, autism, like we need to correct the behavior and have consequences for PDA kids. And the example is like, you know, a kid's really dysregulated, and then once they're regulated again, we need to correct their behavior. We need to talk about what happened, okay? And I read that and I was like, okay, if I had seen that 5 years ago, I would have been like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, if my kid has a huge like panic attack, comes down from it, and in the course of it like destroys something of mine, and I go right back to them an hour later and I'm like, hey, it's not okay to like rip up the pages of a book when you're upset. My son would have gone right back into his activation, compulsively interrupted me, or broken something else. Why is that? Because he was so activated and so far past his threshold, so far into his survival brain, that we can't just oversimplify and say like, yeah, go back to them an hour later and like once they're quote regulated and tell them what to do. It doesn't work over the long term for PDA kids. And so when I see content like that, it makes me upset from the perspective of the parent, because they're going to think, well, I must be doing something wrong. I go back an hour later and I try and talk to my kid and they growl or hiss over what I'm saying, or they start kicking and screaming. Am I doing this wrong? Like this tip or this strategy, I must be the one who's not implementing it right, or maybe I'm not the one seeing it clearly. But what I'm here to tell you as a mom, more than anything, is that like it's not you. It's not that you're doing the strategy wrong. It's that strategy might really work for an ADHD kid, but it might not work for a PDA kid. Okay? And both of those things can be true, and that's okay, right? That's okay. We don't all have to have the same exact approaches to different neurotypes. And again, PDA isn't above or below autism. It isn't above or below ADHD or anxiety. It's just different, okay? The next example I saw was about like completing homework, right? Like if you know, there's resistance or refusal to homework. We've all been in this place if we've even gotten to the conversation of homework, right? Like, I don't even know if I would have ever gotten to the point of like, let's sit down and do homework. But if we were doing this 5 years ago, which we were not, the suggestion was like every couple minutes do a movement break. okay? So, and then the homework will be completed at a faster clip and more of it will be completed. That might work awesome for an ADHD kid. Awesome. So great. Such a good strategy. But for a PDA kid, they're going to be like, A, I'm not even going to sit down to do it. B, the fact that you're telling me to have a movement break is actually activating my nervous system more, making it less likely that I'll do it. And C, the parent is going to be like, well, am I doing these movement breaks wrong? Because it says that this is going to help, right? So what I really need you to understand is like, this isn't you, okay? This is just PDA becoming trendy and people throwing it on to their neurodiversity stuff and being like, here it is. Like, do the same thing I've taught in the ADHD or autism space that works. It should also work for PDA because it's the same thing, right? So now, okay, I never name names and I never throw shade, but I am going to name a name without throwing shade because this is with utmost respect for this person. I want to talk about Dr. Becky Kennedy and Good Inside, okay? So a lot of her stuff, first of all, I think she's a badass businesswoman, no shade. 2, I agree with the premise of her business, and I agree with the premise of how she thinks about children, which is Good Inside, right? That's the name of her book. I believe that children have a divine light, humans have a divine light within them that can never be corrupted. We think the same. 3rd, I think a lot of her stuff is great, but I see a ton of her stuff right now on anxiety, and in a lot of spaces, PDA gets lumped into anxiety. Okay, an anxiety-driven need for control or severe anxiety is what your kids are diagnosed with. And when I see a lot of the stuff that's put out there, like you're enabling them, they need to develop frustration tolerance, they need to get used to it, we need more exposure. In the anxiety space, which is what I'm seeing in the Dr. Kennedy space, that is often the very, very much the right approach for anxious kids. Like, I'm not saying what she's saying is wrong, but I think it can be taken as I should be developing my PDA child's frustration tolerance because they're anxious. But what we have to understand is that this is not the same thing as anxiety. It's a survival drive for autonomy based on the way the brain perceives what's safe and what's dangerous, and it impacts the ability for our children to access their basic needs, which is, I think, a nervous system disability and not the same as anxiety, which is something I have. I'm diagnosed with panic disorder. I have worked a lot on my own frustration tolerance and my own ability to expose myself to triggers, which is what I'm doing right here on Alive. Okay, so I share this with you because there's a lot of confusion in the space right now. There's a lot of lumping together of what PDA is or using the label of PDA because it is trendy, and then giving out information that is not helpful to parents, and it's actually not helpful to the kids that they're trying to raise and provide care to. So before I got on this live, I was nervous and I was scared because I know that saying that PDA is not the same thing as autism, or it's not the same thing as auDHD, or it's not the same thing as an anxiety-driven need for control is controversial, right? It's not what everyone in this space agrees with. But in order to overcome fear, I often look to my spiritual practice, okay? And I want to share this with you. If you're not interested in spirituality or Buddhism, feel free to drop off or tune out at this point. But when I was thinking about whether or not I was going to share this, I was thinking about this concept called near neighbor enemies in Buddhism. Okay, so what is a near neighbor enemy? So what this means is like you have a value like love or compassion. And often when we're thinking about these values, we're thinking, okay, what goes against love? What goes against compassion? So in the case of love, the enemy of love we think of as hate, right? But a near neighbor enemy is actually something that resembles love, but undermines it. So in this case, that would be control. Okay, so the near neighbor enemy of love is control. And that's been a big insight for my journey with my PDA kid, because every time I'm trying to control him, that's when the relationship is undermined, and that's when the activation increases. But the concept that brought me strength to talk about this today is the near neighbor of fierce compassion. So if my ideal is to be fiercely compassionate to parents, fiercely compassionate to this PDA community, then I have to tell the truth and think about what's getting in the way of that. So the near neighbor enemy, or the thing that appears similar to fierce compassion, is sameness. Okay, this idea that everything is the same, and that's actually what compassion is. But when we call things that aren't the same, we're undermining the lived experience, feelings, emotions, and sense of belonging that people have in their community, in their tribe, in their neurotype, okay? So that's just a reflection to sit with if you feel like it at the end of this, like knowing that we can allow difference in this space, that it's okay if PDA is its own thing. And of course, it's okay if you think differently, but that is the premise of the work that I do with parents. This idea of PDA as its own neurotype with its own logic and its own nervous system mechanisms and its own way of supporting a family is what has brought peace to my family and the thousands of parents that we've worked with. So I will end there with that little live with you guys. It was fun to hang out, and I hope that, okay, so I have a question. Jasmine said, if the child has autism and PDA, how do you know which strategy or which neurotype to go with? Okay, so what I usually encourage parents to do is to think about what is working and what's not. So usually parents find me or this page based on an experience that they've had of not having things work like they want them to work, right? Like maybe things are getting worse with dysregulation. Maybe the connection between you two is being undermined. Maybe, access to a basic need, like for my son was eating, maybe for your child is like sleeping, or there's a toileting regression, is getting worse. So what's that telling us? It tells us that maybe if we're thinking about our child's root cause of their struggles through the autism lens, which is the lens of social communication differences, sensory differences, and restricted and repetitive interests, and it's helped some but not enough, we might want to explore a different lens as the priority logic for a period of time, right? So like what we do in our program that we run is, it's not to say the kids in there don't have like autism diagnoses or ADHD diagnoses, but what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to experiment for 3 months, just looking at everything through the PDA lens and logic, and experimenting with how to make decisions as a parent, how to develop a healthy self-concept, how to advocate, and how to accommodate. And then we track how things are improving for the family, right? And that's going to give you the information that you need to say, oh, actually, yes, they're autistic, but the thing that was getting in the way of their daily living and their well-being was actually this nervous system activation around not having autonomy, around feeling below others in a position of authority. And so once you have that awareness, you can understand, like, okay, this is everything that improved. This is what we still might want to work on with an autism expert or an ADHD expert, but often we're conflating, right? Like we have an expert be like, oh, it's all ADHD, but like maybe a big part of why the ADHD strategies aren't working, like what I mentioned with like the movement breaks or like more of the consequences after the kid is regulated, is because it's activating the PDA part of their brain, and they're shutting down their ability to even engage in the strategies. So it really becomes an experiment that parents have to do unless you know for sure that you think that this is the lens from the logic. Yeah. So if you're feeling like nothing is working, my perspective is that if a child is PDA, if a human has a PDA brain, it is the defining feature of that brain, right? It is a survival drive for autonomy that overrides other survival instincts. And so, often we have ADHD, anxiety, and or autism that cause dysregulation, nervous system stress, and avoidance, but don't necessarily rise to what I consider to be a nervous system disability, which is the framework that we work through with parents. So, I think ADHD, autism, anxiety, and PDA, each of those have a different logic, and I think it can be hard to see what the challenges are coming from. I often think that PDA children and teens, the main thing that's going on is that they're PDA, but they're getting this potpourri of diagnoses that is, looking at the behaviors and medical challenges and basic needs struggles and avoidance and putting a bunch of different labels on it, when really we can simplify and just think of it through one lens. Yeah, I love that. It's like autism, ADHD, and PDA are always riding in the car together, but who's driving? It's usually the PDA. Yes. I love that. That's so good. So good. Yeah, great description. Yeah, and often what I tell parents is it doesn't mean that there's not sensory issues or anxiety or, executive functioning differences or social communication differences. But it's what lens are you prioritizing, right? Because if for example, we're prioritizing, okay, their executive function needs help. And we're trying to do all this stuff to help them with their executive functioning. From a PDA neurotype, that's going to be okay, mom is trying to tell me what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and I'm perceiving I don't have autonomy around it. And so I'm going to activate and avoid these strategies that once I have a stronger relationship based on autonomy, once I'm not as close to my nervous system threshold, and once I have self-awareness, I can access these executive function strategies, but we need to first go through the PDA approach, because without that trust, without that window of tolerance, without coming out of burnout, and without understanding why there's even resistance to these strategies or activation around, then, all these great strategies and modalities aren't accessible to PDA children. Yeah. So, if your child, here's the thing, you have to experiment, right? You have to experiment and try and be consistent. And so if you want to think about it simply, I wouldn't think about it necessarily even as a neurotype, but more like a paradigm. Most anxiety, ADHD, autism, all of those strategies are going to be based more on exposure and behavior. That's just the way it is, even if they don't appear like that on the surface. And PDA is really a different way of thinking about and being with your child, which is you're going to go at your own pace, on your own timeline. I'm not going to try and explicitly teach you. I'm going to try and shift the energy between us so that we're more like mentors. I'm going to lower demands. It's a very, very different approach. And so that doesn't work for all kids. But if you are stuck and not making progress, then sometimes we have to experiment with a different way. Okay, my friends, it was nice to be here with you live, and I will see you again soon. Okay, bye.